The Epistle of Paul to Philemon, known simply as Philemon, is one of the books of the Christian New Testament. It is a prison letter, co-authored by Paul the Apostle with Timothy, to Philemon, a leader in the Colossian church. It deals with the themes of forgiveness and reconciliation. Paul does not identify himself as an apostle with authority, but as a prisoner of Jesus Christ, calling Timothy, our brother, and addressing Philemon as fellow laborer, and brother. Onesimus, a slave that had departed from his master Philemon, was returning with this epistle wherein Paul asked Philemon to receive him as a brother beloved. Philemon was a wealthy Christian, possibly a bishop of the house church that met in his home in Colossus. This letter is now generally regarded as one of the undisputed works of Paul. It is the shortest of Paul's extant letters, consisting of only 335 words in the Greek text. Composition. Authorship. The Epistle of Philemon is attributed to the Apostle Paul, and this attribution has rarely been questioned by scholars. Along with 6 others, it is numbered among the undisputed letters, which are widely considered to be authentically Pauline. The main challenge to the letter's authenticity came from a group of German scholars in the 19th century known as the Tübingen School. Their leader, Ferdinand Christian Bohr, only accepted 4 New Testament epistles as genuinely written by Paul: Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians and Galatians. Commenting on Philemon, Bohr described the subject matter as so very singular as to arouse our suspicions, and concluded that it is perhaps a Christian romance serving to convey a genuine Christian idea. The opening verse of the salutation also names Timothy alongside Paul. This, however, does not mean that Timothy was the epistle's co-author. Rather, Paul regularly mentions others in the address if they have a particular connection with the recipient. In this case, Timothy may have encountered Philemon while accompanying Paul in his work in Ephesus. Occasion. According to the majority interpretation, Paul wrote this letter on behalf of Onesimus, a runaway slave who had wronged his owner Philemon. The details of the offense are unstated, although it is often assumed that Onesimus had fled after stealing money, as Paul states in verse 18 that if Onesimus owes anything, Philemon should charge this to Paul's account. Sometime after leaving, Onesimus came into contact with Paul, although again the details are unclear. He may have been arrested and imprisoned alongside Paul. Alternatively, he may have previously heard Paul's name and so traveled to him for help. After meeting Paul, Onesimus became a Christian believer. An affection grew between him, and Paul would have been glad to keep Onesimus with him. However, he considered it better to send him back to Philemon with an accompanying letter, which aimed to effect reconciliation between them as Christian brothers. The preservation of the letter suggests that Paul's request was granted. Onesimus' status as a runaway slave was challenged by Alan Dwight Callahan in an article published in the Harvard Theological Review and in a later commentary. Callahan argues that, beyond verse 16, nothing in the text conclusively indicates that Onesimus was ever the chattel of the letter's chief addressee. Moreover, the expectations fostered by the traditional fugitive slave hypothesis go unrealized in the letter. Modern commentators, even those committed to the prevailing interpretation, have tacitly admitted as much. Callahan argues that the earliest commentators on this work, the Homily of Origen and the Anti-Marcion preface, are silent about Onesimus' possible servile status, and traces the origins of this interpretation to John Chrysostom, who proposed it in his Homily I in Epistolam ad Philemonem, during his ministry in Antioch, circa 386 to 398. In place of the traditional interpretation, Callahan suggests that Onesimus and Philemon are brothers both by blood and religion, but who have become estranged, and the intent of this letter was to reconcile the two men. Ben Witherington III has challenged Callahan's interpretation as a misreading of Paul's rhetoric. Further, Margaret M. Mitchell has demonstrated that a number of writers before Chrysostom either argue or assume that Onesimus was a runaway slave, including Athanasius, Basil of Caesarea and Ambrosiaster. The only extant information about Onesimus apart from this letter is found in Paul's Epistle to the Colossians chapter 4 verses 7-9, where Onesimus is called a faithful and beloved brother. All my state shall Tychicus declare unto you, who is a beloved brother, and a faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord, 8 whom I have sent unto you for the same purpose, that he might know your estate, and comfort your hearts. 9 With Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you, they shall make known unto you all things which are done here. Recipient: the letter is addressed to Philemon, who is described as a fellow worker of Paul. It is generally assumed that Philemon lived in Colossae. In the letter to the Colossians, Onesimus and Archippus are described as members of the church there. Philemon may have converted to Christianity through Paul's ministry, possibly in Ephesus. The salutation mentions 2 other figures beyond Philemon. The first is Apphia, who is probably Philemon's wife. Paul also mentions Archippus, a fellow soldier. Some have speculated that he is the son of Philemon and Apphia. Ronald Knox proposed that Onesimus' owner was in fact Archippus, and the letter was addressed to him rather than Philemon. In this reconstruction, Philemon would receive the letter first and then encourage Archippus to release Onesimus so that he could work alongside Paul. This view, however, has not found widespread support. In particular, Knox's view has been challenged on the basis of the opening verses. According to Bryan, the fact that Philemon's name is mentioned first, together with the use of the phrase, in your house, in verse 2, makes it unlikely that Archippus was the primary addressee. Knox further argued that the letter was intended to be read aloud in the Colossian church in order to put pressure on Archippus. A number of commentators, however, see this view as contradicting the tone of the letter. J.B. Lightfoot, for example, wrote, "The tact and delicacy of the apostles pleading for Onesimus would be nullified at one stroke by the demand for publication." Content. Greeting and introduction. The opening salutation follows a typical pattern found in other Pauline letters. Paul first introduces himself, with a self-designation as a prisoner of Jesus Christ, which in this case refers to a physical imprisonment. He also mentions his associate Timothy, as a valued colleague who was presumably known to the recipient. As well as addressing the letter to Philemon, Paul sends greetings to Apphia, Archippus and the church that meets in Philemon's house. Apphia is often presumed to be Philemon's wife, and Archippus, a fellow laborer, is sometimes suggested to be their son. Paul concludes his salutation with a prayerful wish for grace and peace, thanksgiving and intercession before addressing the main topic of the letter. Paul continues with a paragraph of thanksgiving and intercession. This serves to prepare the ground for Paul's central request. He gives thanks to God for Philemon's love and faith and prays for his faith to be effective. He concludes this paragraph by describing the joy and comfort he has received from knowing how Philemon has shown love towards the Christians in Colossae. Paul's plea for Onesimus. As a background to his specific plea for Onesimus, Paul clarifies his intentions and circumstances. Although he has the boldness to command Philemon to do what would be right in the circumstances, he prefers to base his appeal on his knowledge of Philemon's love and generosity. He also describes the affection he has for Onesimus and the transformation that has taken place with Onesimus's conversion to the Christian faith. Where Onesimus was useless, now he is useful, a wordplay, as Onesimus means useful. Paul indicates that he would have been glad to keep Onesimus with him, but recognized that it was right to send him back. Paul's specific request is for Philemon to welcome Onesimus as he would welcome Paul, namely as a Christian brother. He offers to pay for any debt created by Onesimus' departure and expresses his desire that Philemon might refresh his heart in Christ. conclusion and greetings in the final section of the letter, Paul describes his confidence that Philemon would do even more than he had requested, perhaps indicating his desire for Onesimus to return to work alongside him. He also mentions his wish to visit and asks Philemon to prepare a guest room. Paul sends greetings from 5 of his co-workers and concludes the letter with a benediction. Themes. Paul uses slavery versus freedom language often in his writings as a metaphor. At this time slavery was common, and can be seen as a theme in the book of Philemon. Slavery was most commonly found in households. This letter, seemingly, provided alleviation of suffering of some slaves due to the fact that Paul placed pastoral focus on the issue. Although it is a main theme, Paul does not label slavery as negative or positive. Some scholars see it as unthinkable in the times to even question ending slavery, because slavery was so ingrained into society that the abolitionist would have been at the same time an insurrectionist, and the political effects of such a movement would have been unthinkable. Paul doesn't question it in this epistle. Paul may have envisioned slavery as a fixed institution. He was not questioning the rightness or wrongness of it. Paul did, however, view slavery as a human institution, and believed that all human institutions were about to fade away. This may be because Paul had the perspective that Jesus would return soon. Paul viewed his present world as something that was swiftly passing away. This is a part of Pauline Christianity and theology. When it comes to Onesimus and his circumstance as a slave, Paul felt that Onesimus should return to Philemon, but not as a slave, but under a bond of familial love. Paul also was not suggesting that Onesimus be punished, but Roman law allowed the owner of a runaway slave nearly unlimited privileges of punishment, even execution. This is a concern of Paul and the reason he is writing to Philemon, asking that Philemon accept Onesimus back in a bond of friendship, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Paul is trying to break through the social barriers dividing people. We see this in many of Paul's other epistles, including his letters to the Corinthians, delivering the message of unity with others and unity with Christ, a change of identity, as written in Sacra Pagana, Philippians and Philemon. The move from slave to freedman has to do with the shift in standing under the lordship of Jesus Christ. So in short, Onesimus' honor and obedience is not claimed by Philemon, but by Christ. Verses 13-14 suggest that Paul wants Philemon to send Onesimus back to Paul. Marshall, Travis and Paul write, Paul hoped that it might be possible for Onesimus to spend some time with him as a missionary colleague. If that is not a request for Onesimus to join Paul's circle, I do not know what more would need to be said. Significance. Paul's tactful address to Philemon was labeled "Holy Flattery" by Martin Luther. He saw a parallel between Paul and Christ in their work of reconciliation, which is also contained within the concept of Christian grace. Still, Luther insisted that the letter upheld the social status quo, though not explicit. The text could be interpreted to indicate that Paul did nothing to change Onesimus' legal position as a servant and that Paul was complying with Roman law in returning him to Philemon. However, the text could also be interpreted as indicating that Paul was demanding the legal freedom of Onesimus and, as an act of both trust and reconciliation, holding Philemon accountable in the higher court of God to accomplish this change himself. Sarah Rudin, in her Paul Among the People, argues that in the letter to Philemon Paul created the Western conception of the individual human being, unconditionally precious to God and therefore entitled to the consideration of other human beings. Before Paul, Rudin argues, a slave was considered subhuman, and entitled to no more consideration than an animal. Dearmaid McCulloch, in his A History of Christianity, described the epistle as a Christian foundation document in the justification of slavery. Due to its ambiguity, the letter was a cause of debate during the British and later American struggles over the abolition of slavery. Both sides cited Philemon for support.